Based on all credible historical accounts and the strongest available evidence, Vincent van Gogh's death is widely understood to have been a suicide. Contemporary witnesses, including his doctor and the police, reported that Van Gogh himself stated he had wounded himself, and his long history of severe mental distress supports this conclusion. A later theory suggesting he may have been accidentally shot by local boys remains speculative and is not supported by forensic evidence, as no autopsy, ballistic analysis, or physical investigation was performed in 1890. Modern reinterpretations rely on incomplete medical notes rather than new physical findings. Today's theme: was Vincent van Gogh's death a suicide or a homicide? Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today we're stepping into one of the most debated, emotionally charged, and misunderstood chapters in art history, the final hours of Vincent van Gogh. For more than a century, the world has asked the same haunting question. Was his death a suicide, or could it have been something else? A tragic accident? A moment of despair? Or a story that has never fully uncovered? To help us navigate this complex terrain, the facts, the myths, the emotional truth beneath the speculation, we're joined by someone whose insight into Vincent's inner world is both rare and deeply resonant. Thor Sivert Fritland is with us today. Thor, welcome. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you. It's powerful to be part of this conversation. Van Gogh's death is often treated like a mystery to be solved. But behind the theories and the speculation is a human being, sensitive, exhausted, misunderstood, whose final days deserve compassion as much as analysis. I'm glad we're exploring not just how he died, but what his life reveals about vulnerability, emotional pressure, and the weight of being profoundly sensitive in a world that didn't know how to hold him.
Exactly. And that's why today's theme matters. This isn't about sensationalizing a tragedy, it's about understanding the emotional landscape that shaped Vincent's final choices and examining the evidence with clarity rather than myth. So, let's begin. Let's step into the final chapter of Vincent van Gogh's life and ask, with honesty and nuance, was his death a suicide or a homicide? And more importantly, what does the truth teach us about the man behind the myth? One introduction. Thor, there's been a lot of debate in recent years about Vincent van Gogh's death. Some claim he was murdered, others insist it was suicide. You've studied psychological and historical context deeply. So let's start here. What do we know?
What we know is that the historical record is thin, the forensic evidence is limited, and the emotional landscape of his final months is far more revealing than the physical details. But even with all that, the strongest evidence still supports suicide. The murder theory is intriguing, but it's built on speculation, not forensics.
People often say, new forensic evidence suggests he was shot by someone else. What does that refer to?
Mostly to reinterpretations, not new evidence. There was no forensic investigation in 1890, no ballistic analysis, no autopsy. The so-called new forensics are modern scholars trying to reconstruct the wound based on vague 19th century doctors' notes.
So, was Vincent van Gogh killed?
There's no credible forensic evidence that he was. There's no witness, no physical proof, no confession, no investigation. The strongest evidence, historical, psychological, and testimonial, supports suicide. But the deeper truth is this: Van Gogh didn't die because of a bullet. He died because of a lifetime of internal violence, illness, isolation, despair that finally overwhelmed him.
And that's the tragedy.
Yes, not the mystery of his death, but the suffering that led him there.
So, nothing physically was examined?
Exactly. There's no bullet, no gun, no tissue samples. The only physical object ever found was a rusted revolver discovered in 1960, 70 years later, and it's impossible to link it to the shooting. So when people say forensic evidence, what they really mean is modern interpretation of old descriptions.
Let's talk about the murder theory. Where did it come from?
It was popularized by a 2011 biography by Naifeh and Smith. They suggested that a local teenager, René Secretan, might have accidentally shot Van Gogh. Their argument is psychological and circumstantial, not forensic. They point to the odd angle of the wound, the fact that the gun was never found, Secretan's reputation for bullying, Van Gogh's tendency to protect others from blame. But none of this is evidence. It's narrative possibility.
So, it's a story, not a conclusion.
Exactly. It's compelling, but it's not supported by hard data.
Let's flip it. What supports the suicide explanation?
Quite a lot. First, Van Gogh himself told the police and his doctor, "Do not accuse anyone else. I wounded myself." Second, Dr. Gachet wrote to Theo that Vincent had attempted suicide. Third, Vincent had a long history of suicidal ideation, documented in letters. Fourth, his final months were marked by despair, exhaustion, and a sense of being a burden.
So, the psychological profile aligns with suicide.
Very strongly. He wasn't in a moment of inspiration. He was in a moment of collapse.
People often point to the angle of the wound as proof he couldn't have shot himself.
And that's where modern forensic reasoning gets misused. The doctor's notes are vague. We don't know the exact angle, depth, or distance. We don't know the position of his body. We don't know if he was sitting, standing, or leaning. Trying to reconstruct a ballistic trajectory from incomplete 19th century notes is like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
So, the wound doesn't prove murder.
Not at all. It doesn't prove anything except that he was shot,
Why do you think people want the murder theory to be true?
because it's easier to believe he was killed than to face the reality of his despair. The murder theory lets us rewrite the ending into something less painful. It also fits our cultural fascination with mystery. But the truth is quieter, sadder, and more human. Van Gogh was exhausted. He felt like a burden. He believed his work had failed. He didn't see a future for himself.
And that's harder to sit with.
Much harder. But it's also more honest.
So, if we strip away speculation, what remains?
A man who had fought his mind for years. A man who had endured poverty, rejection, and illness. A man who felt he was hurting the one person who loved him most, Theo. A man who believed he had no place in the world. Whether the shot was intentional or accidental, the emotional truth is the same. Van Gogh was at the end of his strength.
To Vincent van Gogh's final 48 hours. Thor, before we get lost in theories or speculation, I want to ground this conversation in something essential. When we look at the final days of Vincent van Gogh's life, the letters, the eyewitness accounts, the emotional tone of his writing, what is the first thing we need to understand to approach the question of whether his death was a suicide or a homicide? What is the emotional or psychological foundation we must acknowledge before we can even begin to interpret the events of those last 48 hours? Thor, we enter a space that's both historically documented and emotionally charged. You've studied his letters, the testimonies from the Revuin, and the accounts from Dr. Gachet. How do you begin to reconstruct those last 2 days?
With humility, honestly. Because what we're looking at isn't just a timeline, it's the emotional residue of a man who had been fighting for years. The facts are sparse, but the texture of those hours is incredibly vivid when you read the letters and the witness accounts together. It becomes a portrait of exhaustion, resignation, and a kind of quiet dignity.
Let's start with the morning of July 27. What do we know?
We know he left the Revuin early, as he always did. Adeline Revu, the innkeeper's daughter, remembered him as calm, even cheerful. But with Vincent, calmness often meant something else. A kind of emotional stillness that comes when someone has decided they're no longer fighting.
Almost like a settling.
Exactly. And we know he carried his painting gear. He walked toward the wheat fields, the same fields he'd been painting obsessively. Those fields were symbolic for him, vast, open, golden, but also overwhelming. They mirrored his inner world.
His last letter to Theo is often mentioned in this context. How does it shape our understanding?
It's heartbreaking, he wrote. I feel like a failure, and then crossed it out, but the ink remained. That tells you everything. He was trying to protect Theo from his despair, but he couldn't fully hide it. That emotional tension is the backdrop of his final day.
Witnesses saw him painting that afternoon, right?
Yes. He worked intensely, almost feverishly. That was typical of him when he was emotionally overwhelmed. He painted to keep himself from unraveling. But at some point, he left the easel and walked behind a stand of trees. A gunshot was heard. No one investigated. Gunshots were common in rural France.
And then he walked back?
Yes. Nearly a mile. Bent over, holding his chest, but steady. That detail always strikes me. It shows how accustomed he was to enduring pain physically and emotionally.
What happened when he returned to the Revue Inn?
He walked upstairs by himself. Adeline said his face was calm, as if nothing had happened. When they finally reached his room, he told them, "I tried to kill myself." He refused a doctor at first. When Dr. Gachet arrived, Vincent repeated, "Do not accuse anyone. I did it to myself."
Interviewer, that's a powerful statement.
It is. And it's consistent with his lifelong pattern of protecting others from blame, even when he was suffering.
Theo arrives the next morning. What do we know about their final conversation?
Theo later wrote about it. He said Vincent looked at him with a faint smile and said, "I wish I could go home now." And then, this is how I wanted to go. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't chaotic. It was quiet. Two brothers who had carried each other through everything.
There's something devastating about the simplicity of it.
Yes. Vincent apologized repeatedly for being a burden. Theo told him he wasn't. But Vincent didn't believe it. That's the tragedy. He died thinking he had failed the one person who loved him most.
What do we know about the last hours?
He remained lucid. He asked for his pipe. He spoke softly. He told Theo, "I think I have done my best." That line. It's almost unbearable. Because he had done more than his best. He had created beauty out of suffering. But he couldn't see it.
And his final words?
Witnesses say he whispered, "The sadness will last forever." It wasn't a prophecy. It was a description of how he felt in that moment, that the sadness inside him was endless.
So, when we reconstruct these final 48 hours, what emerges?
A man who was exhausted. A man who had fought his mind, his circumstances, and his isolation for too long. A man who believed he was a burden. A man who didn't know that the world would one day love him. His death wasn't a mystery. It was the culmination of a lifetime of internal violence, and the final moment of a bond between two brothers who loved each other fiercely.
3. Psychological analysis of Vincent van Gogh's final letter. Thor, when people talk about Vincent van Gogh's final days, they often mention his last letter to Theo. It's a short letter, unfinished, but it carries enormous emotional weight. From a psychological perspective, what stands out to you when you read it?
What strikes me first is the tension between hope and despair. Van Gogh writes about his work, about the future, about the challenges of selling art. But underneath all of that, there's this unmistakable fatigue. It's the voice of someone who's still trying to function, still trying to communicate, but who's emotionally depleted. You can feel the weight pressing through the lines.
There's that famous line, "I feel like a failure," which he crossed out. What does that reveal?
That crossed out line is one of the most psychologically revealing things he ever wrote. When someone crosses out a sentence like that, it's not because they didn't mean it. It's because they meant it too much. It shows a conflict between his internal world and his desire not to burden Theo. He's trying to protect his brother from the depth of his despair. But the ink remains. The emotion remains. It's a moment where the unconscious leaks through the cracks.
Almost like he couldn't fully hide the truth from Theo or from himself.
Exactly. It's a moment of emotional transparency, even in erasure. Interviewer. When you read the letter, the tone is surprisingly practical. He talks about exhibitions, money, and the art market.
How do you interpret that?
That's actually very common in people who are struggling internally. They cling to structure, to tasks, to logistics, to anything that feels concrete. It's a way of staying tethered to the world. But when you read between the lines, you sense the emotional erosion. He's talking about the art market, but the subtext is, I don't know if I can keep doing this. It's the language of someone who's trying to hold on but slipping.
Theo is such a central figure in Vincent's life. How does that relationship show up in the letter?
It's everywhere, even when it's not explicit. Theo wasn't just a brother. He was Vincent's emotional anchor, his financial support, his confidant, his lifeline. In the letter, Vincent is trying to reassure Theo. He's trying to sound stable, competent, forward-looking. But the emotional truth is that he feels like a burden. He feels guilty for needing so much. And that guilt is psychologically corrosive.
So, the letter becomes a kind of emotional mask.
Yes, a mask that's slipping.
What cognitive patterns do you see in the letter?
Several, and they're consistent with someone in deep psychological distress. Rumination. He circles around the same themes: failure, financial strain, artistic worth. Self-blame. He internalizes everything that's going wrong. Hopelessness. Not dramatic, but quiet, pervasive. Emotional flattening. The tone is muted, almost numb. Catastrophic thinking. He interprets setbacks as personal failures. These patterns don't appear suddenly. They're the culmination of years of instability, illness, and emotional isolation.
The letter was found in his pocket, unfinished. What does that suggest to you?
It suggests interruption, not just of the letter, but of his emotional process. He was in the middle of trying to articulate something to Theo. Something about his work, his future, his fears. And then he stopped. The unfinished letter mirrors his psychological state. Fragmented, unresolved, suspended between hope and despair.
It's almost symbolic.
It is. It's the emotional equivalent of a sentence that trails off.
If you had to summarize the emotional truth of that letter, what would you say?
I'd say it's the voice of a man who's trying to stay connected, but who feels himself slipping away. A man who loves his brother deeply, but feels unworthy of that love. A man who's still fighting, but who's exhausted by the fight. A man who believes he has failed, even though history will prove the opposite. It's not a suicide note, but it's the letter of someone who is emotionally collapsing.
So, the letter doesn't tell us why he died, but it tells us how he felt.
Exactly. It's not evidence of intent. It's evidence of emotional reality. And that reality was shaped by years of illness, poverty, rejection, and internal violence. The letter is a window into a mind that's tired, deeply, profoundly tired, and into a heart that never stopped loving, even when it couldn't feel loved in return.
That's a powerful way to see it.
It's important to honor the human truth behind the myth.
For psychological profile of Vincent van Gogh in his final month. Or, when we look at Vincent van Gogh's final month, we're looking at a man who is still painting prolifically, still writing letters, still trying to stay connected, and yet clearly unraveling internally. From a psychological standpoint, how would you describe his state during those last weeks?
I'd describe it as a combination of emotional exhaustion, chronic self-doubt, and a deepening sense of isolation. He wasn't in a dramatic spiral, it was quieter than that. It was the slow collapse of someone who had been fighting for far too long. His letters show a man who's functioning on the surface, but internally he's fraying.
People often imagine his final month as chaotic or explosive, but the evidence suggests something different.
Exactly. There's no sign of mania, no sign of frenzy. What we see is fatigue, a profound, existential fatigue. He was painting constantly, but painting had become less of a joy and more of a lifeline. He was holding himself together through routine. Emotionally, he was worn down. Not in a theatrical way, in a quiet, resigned way.
His letters show a lot of self-criticism. How does that shape his psychological profile?
It's central. Vincent's self-perception in that final month is dominated by guilt and inadequacy. He believed he was a burden to Theo, financially, emotionally, professionally. And that belief is devastating because it wasn't true. But psychologically, it felt true to him. He interpreted every setback as a personal failure, every silence as rejection, every difficulty as proof that he wasn't enough.
So, his internal narrative was collapsing.
Yes, and once your internal narrative collapses, everything else becomes harder to hold on to.
Theo was the most important person in Vincent's life. How did that relationship affect his final month?
Theo was his anchor, emotionally, financially, artistically. But in the final month, Theo was struggling too. He had a newborn, he was sick, and he was facing job insecurity. Vincent sensed this shift, and instead of feeling supported, he felt guilty. He feared he was draining Theo's strength at a time when Theo needed his own stability. That fear of being a burden to the one person who loved him unconditionally is psychologically crushing.
It's heartbreaking because their bond was so deep.
Yes. And that depth made Vincent's guilt even heavier.
He was painting some of his most extraordinary works during this time. How does that coexist with his despair?
That's the paradox of Van Gogh. His creativity didn't disappear when he suffered, it intensified. But not because the suffering fueled the art. It's because the art was his way of surviving the suffering. In his final month, he painted with urgency, almost as if he knew time was running out. But psychologically, he didn't see the value of what he was creating. He thought he was failing. He thought his work had no future.
Which is tragic, given what we know now.
It's one of the great tragedies of art history. He died believing he had no impact.
What cognitive patterns do you see in his letters from that month?
Several patterns stand out. Rumination. He circles around the same fears: failure, burden, rejection. Hopelessness. Not dramatic, but steady. A sense that nothing will improve. Emotional numbing. His tone becomes flatter, more muted. Self-blame. He interprets external problems as personal shortcomings. Catastrophic thinking. Small setbacks feel like existential threats. These patterns don't appear suddenly. They're the culmination of years of instability, manipulation, illness, and emotional strain.
He was still painting, still writing, still walking miles every day. How do we reconcile that with his psychological decline?
Functioning doesn't mean thriving. Many people in deep emotional pain maintain routines, sometimes even rigidly, because routine is the only thing holding them together. Vincent's productivity wasn't a sign of stability. It was a coping mechanism, a way to keep the darkness at bay, a way to stay tethered to the world.
So, the paintings were a form of self-preservation.
Absolutely. They were his way of staying alive, until they weren't enough anymore.
If you had to summarize Vincent's psychological profile in his final month, how would you describe it?
I'd describe it as emotionally exhausted, deeply self-critical, burdened by guilt, isolated despite connection, creatively driven but spiritually depleted, holding on through routine, unable to see his own worth. He wasn't in a dramatic breakdown. He was in a slow, quiet collapse, the kind that happens when someone has fought too long without relief.
And that makes his story even more human.
Yes, because it reminds us that suffering isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent, steady, and invisible, even to the person experiencing it.
5. Psychological comparison. Vincent's early versus late years. Thor, we've talked about Vincent's final month, but I want to zoom out. When you compare Vincent van Gogh's early psychological landscape to his later years, the contrast is striking. How would you begin to describe that evolution?
I'd say the shift is from idealistic intensity to exhausted resignation. In his early years, Vincent was restless, passionate, searching, but he still believed in the possibility of belonging. By his later years, that belief had eroded. The sensitivity was still there, the passion was still there, but the hope had thinned out. He wasn't fighting for a place in the world anymore. He was fighting to survive his own mind.
Let's start with the early years. What defined Vincent psychologically in that period?
Intensity. That's the word that captures him. In his early 20s, he threw himself into everything with total emotional commitment: religion, teaching, missionary work, relationships. He wasn't dabbling, he was immersing. He wanted to serve, to help, to live with moral purpose. But that intensity came with fragility. He over-identified with suffering. He gave away his possessions. He lived in extreme self-denial. He pushed himself to the edge because he believed that was the only way to be worthy.
So even then, the seeds of later instability were present.
Absolutely. The emotional wiring was already there, the sensitivity, the idealism, all-or-nothing thinking. But in the early years, it was still fueled by hope.
What changes in the middle period, when he turns disillusionment into art?
This is where we see a psychological pivot. After being rejected by the church, by employers, by romantic interests, he redirects all that intensity into art. Art becomes a new identity, a new mission. But the emotional pattern remains. He works obsessively, isolates himself, pushes his body to extremes. He's still trying to prove something to himself, to his family, to the world. There's hope, but it's more fragile now. He's beginning to feel the weight of repeated failure.
Or late years, exhaustion, isolation, and emotional collapse. Now let's move to the late years, exhaustion, isolation, and emotional collapse. What's the psychological tone there?
The tone is exhaustion, not dramatic breakdown, but slow erosion. By the time he reaches Arles and later St. Remy, he's been fighting for years. Fighting poverty, fighting rejection, fighting his own mind. The intensity is still there, but it's no longer idealistic. It's survival-driven. He paints not because he's inspired, but because painting is the only thing keeping him tethered to reality.
So, passion becomes a coping mechanism.
Exactly. In the early years, art was a calling. In the late years, it was a lifeline.
How do his relationships shift psychologically from early to late life?
In the early years, Vincent was seeking connection desperately. He wanted love, friendship, and community. He wrote long letters. He tried to form bonds. He wanted to belong. In the late years, he still longs for connection, but he no longer believes he deserves it. He sees himself as a burden, especially to Theo. That shift is devastating. Early Vincent, please see me. Please understand me. Late Vincent, I'm sorry for existing.
That's a heartbreaking transformation.
It is, and it's one of the clearest indicators of his psychological decline. 6 cognitive patterns, from idealistic overreach to hopeless rumination.
What about his thinking patterns? How do they evolve?
Early Vincent is driven by idealistic overreach. Grand plans, moral missions, intense aspirations. He believes he can change his life through sheer will. Late Vincent is dominated by hopeless rumination, circling thoughts of failure, guilt, inadequacy. He interprets setbacks as proof that he's worthless. The shift is from, I can become something meaningful, to, I have failed at everything.
Emotionally, what changes?
Early Vincent is turbulent, passionate highs, crushing lows, but still emotionally alive. He feels everything intensely. Late Vincent is emotionally flattened, not numb in a cold way, numb in a tired way. The emotional storms still come, but the recovery is slower. The hope is thinner. The resilience is worn down.
So, the emotional palette narrows.
Yes. It becomes dominated by fatigue, guilt, and resignation.
If you had to summarize the psychological difference between early and late Vincent, how would you describe it?
Early Vincent is a man searching for purpose. Late Vincent is a man searching for relief. Early Vincent believes he can earn love through effort. Late Vincent believes he's unworthy of love no matter what he does. Early Vincent is driven by idealism. Late Vincent is driven by survival. Early Vincent is fighting to enter the world. Late Vincent is fighting not to disappear from it.
That's a profound shift.
It is, and it's what makes his story so human. Because it shows how a lifetime of sensitivity, rejection, and internal violence can reshape a person's entire emotional landscape.
6. Vincent van Gogh and psychological manipulation in his relationships. Thor, I want to approach a delicate angle. Today we talk about psychological manipulation, emotional abuse, even narcissistic relational patterns. Obviously, these are modern terms. But when you look at Vincent van Gogh's relationships, family, romantic partners, colleagues, do you see dynamics that resemble what we now call psychological manipulation?
I think the key is to be careful. We can't retroactively diagnose anyone, and we can't impose modern clinical labels on 19th century relationships. But we can look at patterns of behavior, patterns of control, invalidation, emotional inconsistency, and ask whether those dynamics may have shaped Vincent's psychological world. And yes, some of his relationships absolutely contained elements that today we would recognize as emotionally harmful.
Let's start with Vincent himself. Was he particularly vulnerable to these dynamics?
Very much so. Vincent was extraordinarily sensitive, emotionally porous, deeply empathetic, and desperate for connection. People like that often become magnets for relationships where the emotional power is unbalanced. He wanted to be loved so intensely that he tolerated behaviors that were dismissive, inconsistent, or even cruel. Not because he lacked strength, but because he valued connection above self-protection.
What about his family? Do we see any patterns there?
We see a lot of emotional misattune, not intentional harm, but a chronic inability to understand him. His parents loved him, but they didn't see him. They wanted him to be stable, respectable, and conventional. And when he wasn't, they responded with criticism, pressure, and disappointment. Today, we might call that invalidating. Not abusive, but emotionally harmful for someone as sensitive as Vincent.
So he internalized the message that he was wrong.
Exactly. And that belief followed him for the rest of his life.
What about his romantic relationships? Some of them were turbulent.
Turbulent is an understatement. Vincent often fell in love with people who were unavailable, emotionally or practically. And when he did form a relationship, like with Sean Hornick, the dynamic was complicated. There were elements of mutual need, but also instability, dependency, and emotional volatility. Not manipulation in the modern sense, but certainly dysregulated relational patterns that left Vincent feeling rejected, ashamed, or responsible for someone else's suffering.
So he kept ending up in relationships where he felt not enough.
Yes, and that reinforced his deepest fear.
Let's talk about Gauguin. Their relationship is often described as intense and destructive. Could that be seen as manipulative?
Gauguin was charismatic, confident, and dominant. Vincent admired him, almost idolized him. That created a power imbalance. Gauguin could be dismissive, controlling, and emotionally unpredictable. He criticized Vincent's work, challenged his identity, and withdrew affection when Vincent needed stability. Today, we might call that emotionally destabilizing behavior. Not necessarily intentional manipulation, but certainly a dynamic where Vincent's emotional needs were minimized or invalidated.
And Vincent blamed himself for the conflict.
Always. That's a hallmark of someone who's been emotionally conditioned to take responsibility for relational tension.
So, the big question, could these relational patterns, the invalidation, inconsistency, the emotional pressure, have contributed to his psychological collapse?
They didn't cause his illness, but they absolutely amplified his suffering. When someone is already vulnerable, sensitive, self-critical, emotionally intense, relationships that are unstable or invalidating can deepen despair. Vincent wasn't driven to suicide by any one person, but the accumulation of emotional misattunement, rejection, and relational instability created a psychological environment where he felt increasingly alone.
So, it wasn't manipulated in the modern sense, but it was still harmful.
Exactly. We're not talking about narcissistic abuse as a clinical category. We're talking about patterns of emotional harm that Vincent absorbed deeply because of who he was.
Some people wonder if he was driven crazy by the people around him. How do you respond to that?
No one made Vincent mentally ill. Mental illness is complex, biological, psychological, environmental. But the relationships around him often lacked the stability, empathy, and attunement he needed. He wasn't manipulated into despair. He was unsupported in his despair. And that's a crucial difference.
So, the tragedy is not that he was abused, but that he was misunderstood.
Yes. Profoundly misunderstood. And for someone as sensitive as Vincent, misunderstanding can feel like abandonment.
Thor, this has been incredibly insightful. You've shown that we don't need to impose modern labels to understand that Vincent lived in relational environments that were emotionally difficult for him.
Exactly. The goal isn't to diagnose the past. It's to understand the emotional truth. Vincent van Gogh was a man who needed gentleness, stability, and attunement, and he rarely received them. Not because people were malicious, but because they didn't know how to meet someone with his level of sensitivity. And that mismatch between who he was and what the world offered shaped his entire life.
7. Vincent van Gogh's sensitivity as a psychological trait. Thor, we've talked about Vincent's relationships, his emotional world, and the pressures he faced. But I want to focus on something more foundational, his sensitivity. It seems to be the core of everything. How would you describe Vincent's sensitivity as a psychological trait?
I describe it as radical sensitivity, the kind that shapes a person's entire way of being. Vincent didn't just feel emotions, he absorbed them. He didn't just observe the world, he internalized it. His sensitivity wasn't a flaw, it was his defining feature. But in a world that didn't know how to hold that kind of intensity, it became a source of pain as much as beauty.
When you say radical sensitivity, what do you mean in practical terms?
I mean that Vincent perceived the world with an unusual level of depth. Colors, textures, human expressions, they didn't just register, they resonated. He saw emotional truth in landscapes. He saw spiritual meaning in ordinary people. He saw beauty where others saw nothing. This kind of perceptual sensitivity is a gift, but it also means the world hits you harder. You don't have the filters most people rely on.
And emotionally? How did his sensitivity show up in relationships?
He felt other people's suffering as if it were his own. When he worked as a missionary, he didn't just help the poor, he lived like them. He gave away his clothes, his food, his money. He didn't know how to care about people without caring with them. That level of empathy is beautiful, but it's also dangerous. It blurs boundaries. It makes you vulnerable to emotional overwhelm. And it makes rejection feel catastrophic.
Do you think his sensitivity made him more dependent on connection?
Absolutely. Sensitive people often need deeper, more attuned relationships to feel safe. But Vincent rarely found that. He was misunderstood by his family, rejected by romantic partners, dismissed by colleagues. So, his sensitivity, which could have been a source of connection, became a source of loneliness. He wasn't too much. He was simply too sensitive for the environments he was placed in.
How did this sensitivity shape his art?
It was his art. His brushstrokes are emotional signatures. His colors are psychological states. His landscapes are inner landscapes. He painted the world not as it looked, but as it felt. That sensitivity turned into expression. But it's also why painting was exhausting for him. He wasn't just depicting scenes. He was translating emotional experience into color.
Do you think his sensitivity contributed to his suffering?
Yes, not because sensitivity is inherently painful, but because the world around him wasn't built for someone like him. He felt rejection more deeply. He felt failure more personally. He felt loneliness more intensely. And when you combine that with poverty, instability, and mental illness, sensitivity becomes a magnifier. It amplifies everything, the beauty and the pain.
It sounds like his sensitivity was constantly misinterpreted.
It was. People saw him as difficult, intense, erratic. But what they were really seeing was someone who felt too much and had nowhere to put it. He wasn't dramatic. He was overwhelmed. He wasn't unstable. He was unprotected. He wasn't crazy. He was sensitive in a world that rewarded emotional armor.
Theo seems to be the only person who understood that sensitivity.
Theo didn't just understand it, he honored it. He saw Vincent's sensitivity as a strength, not a flaw. He didn't try to fix him or harden him. He supported him emotionally and financially because he recognized that Vincent's sensitivity was the source of his art. Theo was the one place where Vincent's sensitivity wasn't punished, and that's why their bond was so profound.
So, when we look at Vincent's life through the lens of sensitivity, what do we learn?
We learn that sensitivity is not weakness, it's a form of perception. We learn that sensitive people need environments that honor their depth. We learn that art often comes from those who feel the world intensely. And we learn that Vincent's tragedy wasn't his sensitivity, it was the world's inability to hold it. His sensitivity didn't destroy him, the lack of understanding around it did. And yet, that same sensitivity is what allows millions of people today to stand in front of his paintings and feel something awakened inside them.
That's a beautiful way to see it.
It's the only way that does justice to who he was.
8 scene-based narrative of Vincent's sensitivity in action. Thor, you've described Vincent's sensitivity as a defining psychological trait, something that shaped his art, his relationships, and his suffering. Could you walk us into a scene, almost like a moment in his life, where that sensitivity becomes visible?
Absolutely. When you study Vincent's letters and the testimonies of people who knew him, certain scenes almost rise off the page. Let me take you into one, a moment that captures his sensitivity not as an abstract idea, but as a lived experience. Picture Vincent in Arles, late afternoon. The sun is low, the light is thick, and the wheat field is moving like a living organism. Most people would see a field. Vincent sees a conversation between wind and earth, between color and emotion. He sets up his easel, but he doesn't paint immediately. He watches. He listens. He lets the field tell him what it feels like. This is sensitivity in action. He's not imposing his vision on the landscape, he's receiving it.
So, he's attuning to the world, not extracting from it.
Exactly. He's absorbing the emotional temperature of the environment. And that's why his paintings vibrate. They're not depictions, they're translations of feeling. Interviewer, can you give another example? Yes, the night he painted Cafe Terrace at night. He wasn't just painting a street scene. He was painting the emotional geometry of human presence. He noticed how the warm light spilled onto the cobblestones like an invitation. He noticed how the darkness behind the cafe wasn't threatening, it was protective, like a velvet curtain. He noticed how the people sitting at the tables weren't just customers, they were small universes of longing, conversation, loneliness, and connection. Most artists would sketch the architecture. Vincent sketched the atmosphere.
He painted the feeling of being there.
Yes, and that sensitivity turned into art.
What about a moment that shows his sensitivity toward people?
There's a scene from Saint Remy that always stays with me. Vincent is in the hospital ward, surrounded by patients who are suffering, some quietly, some loudly, some lost in their own minds. Most people would withdraw. Vincent leans in. He sketches them not as patients, but as human beings with dignity. He notices the way a man's hands tremble when he tries to drink water. He notices the way a woman stares at the floor as if searching for a memory she can't retrieve. He notices the way the light falls on their faces, not to aestheticize them, but to honor them. His sensitivity becomes compassion. He sees their humanity even when they can't see it themselves.
So, his sensitivity wasn't just perceptual, it was relational.
Exactly. He didn't just feel deeply, he cared deeply.
What about a moment with Theo? Their relationship is so central.
There's a scene that plays out in almost every letter he writes. Vincent sits at a small table, candle burning low, ink smudged on his fingers. He's exhausted, but he writes anyway, because writing to Theo is how he stays tethered to the world. He doesn't just update Theo on his work. He pours out his fears, his hopes, his gratitude. He worries about Theo's health, his finances, his marriage. He apologizes for being a burden, even when he isn't. This is sensitivity turned inward. He feels responsible for the emotional well-being of the person who supports him most.
It's almost like he feels too much love.
Yes, and that love becomes both his anchor and his ache.
Is there a moment where his sensitivity shows up in something small, something ordinary?
Absolutely, the painting of the shoes. It's one of the most intimate examples. He buys a pair of worn-out work shoes at a flea market. Most people would see trash. Vincent sees a life. He imagines the miles those shoes have walked, the mud they've trudged through, the fatigue of the person who wore them, the dignity of labor, the poetry of survival. He paints them not as objects, but as portraits.
He sees the soul in the mundane.
Exactly. That's sensitivity, the ability to find humanity in the overlooked.
Thor, these scenes make Vincent feel so alive, not as a myth, but as a person. What do they tell us about his sensitivity?
They tell us that his sensitivity wasn't a mood or a quirk, it was a way of being. He experienced the world with an intensity that most people never touch. He felt the emotional temperature of landscapes, people, objects, and relationships. He translated that sensitivity into art that still moves people today. But they also tell us something else. That sensitivity without support becomes vulnerability. And Vincent lived in a world that didn't know how to hold someone like him.
So, his sensitivity was both his gift and his burden.
Yes, and his legacy is the beauty he created from that tension.
9. Could Vincent's breakdown be misinterpreted as the result of manipulative relational dynamics? Thor, I want to explore a delicate angle. Today we talk about narcissistic manipulation, emotional abuse, gaslighting, terms that didn't exist in the 19th century. When we look at Vincent van Gogh's breakdowns, is it possible that some of what he experienced could resemble what we now call emotionally manipulative relational dynamics?
It's a thoughtful question, and the key is to approach it with nuance. We can't retroactively diagnose anyone, and we shouldn't label historical figures with modern clinical terms. But we can examine relational patterns, especially patterns of invalidation, inconsistency, emotional pressure, or chronic misunderstanding, and ask whether those dynamics contributed to Vincent's psychological collapse. And yes, some of the relational environments he lived in contained elements that today we might recognize as emotionally destabilizing.
You've talked a lot about Vincent's sensitivity. How does that factor into this?
It's central. Vincent wasn't just sensitive, he was emotionally porous. He absorbed the emotional climate around him. He took criticism deeply. He internalized rejection. He blamed himself for relational tension even when he wasn't at fault. People with that level of sensitivity are more vulnerable to relational dynamics that are inconsistent, invalidating, or emotionally unpredictable. Not because they're weak, but because they feel everything more intensely.
Let's start with his family. Do we see anything there that resembles emotional manipulation?
Not manipulation in the intentional sense, but we do see chronic emotional misattunement. His parents loved him, but they didn't understand him. They wanted him to be stable, respectable, conventional, and when he wasn't, they responded with pressure, criticism, and disappointment. For someone like Vincent, that kind of environment can feel like emotional rejection, not because the parents were malicious, but because they didn't know how to meet a child with his level of emotional intensity.
So, the harm wasn't intentional, but it was still harmful.
Exactly. Emotional misattune can be deeply wounding, especially for a sensitive person.
What about his romantic relationships? Some of them were turbulent.
Very turbulent. Vincent often fell in love with people who were unavailable, emotionally or practically. And when he formed a relationship, like with Sean Hornick, the dynamic was complicated. Mutual need, instability, dependency, and emotional volatility. Again, not manipulation, but emotionally chaotic environments that left Vincent feeling rejected, ashamed, or responsible for someone else's suffering. For a sensitive person, that can feel like emotional whiplash.
Let's talk about Gauguin. Their relationship is often described as intense and destructive. Could that resemble manipulative dynamics?
There were elements that today we might call emotionally destabilizing. Gauguin was charismatic, dominant, and confident. Vincent admired him, almost idolized him. That created a power imbalance. Gwen could be dismissive, controlling, and emotionally unpredictable. He criticized Vincent's work harshly. He withdrew affection or approval when Vincent needed stability. He made decisions without considering Vincent's emotional state. Again, not necessarily intentional manipulation, but the effect on Vincent was destabilizing.
So, the dynamic itself was harmful, even if the intent wasn't.
Exactly. Intent and impact are not the same.
So, the big question, could these relational patterns, the invalidation, the inconsistency, the emotional pressure, have contributed to Vincent's mental breakdowns?
They didn't cause his illness, but they absolutely amplified his suffering. Vincent already had a vulnerable psychological makeup, sensitivity, emotional intensity, self-criticism. When you place someone like that in environments that are unstable, invalidating, or emotionally unpredictable, the impact can be profound. He wasn't manipulated into madness, but he was unsupported in his vulnerability, and that lack of emotional safety can accelerate psychological collapse.
Do you think some of his breakdowns were misinterpreted by others as madness, when they might have been reactions to emotional overwhelm?
Absolutely. People around him often saw his emotional intensity as instability. They saw his sensitivity as volatility. They saw his overwhelm as madness. But when you read his letters, you see a man who is deeply self-aware, deeply reflective, and deeply wounded by relational dynamics that he didn't know how to navigate. Some of what was labeled madness was emotional overload, the kind that happens when a sensitive person is repeatedly misunderstood, rejected, or invalidated.
So, the tragedy isn't that he was manipulated, but that he was emotionally unprotected.
Exactly. Vincent wasn't a victim of narcissistic abuse in the modern clinical sense, but he was the victim of chronic emotional misattunement, a world that didn't know how to hold someone with his level of sensitivity. His breakdowns weren't the result of manipulation. They were the result of vulnerability without support, sensitivity without understanding, and a lifetime of emotional environments that were too harsh for someone who felt everything so deeply.
That's a powerful and compassionate way to see it.
It's the only way that honors the complexity of his life and the humanity behind his suffering.
10. Could relational dynamics have contributed to Vincent's suffering? Thor, you've painted a vivid picture of Vincent's sensitivity and emotional vulnerability. I want to ask something carefully. Could some of his suffering, even his breakdowns, have been influenced by relational dynamics that today we might describe as manipulative or emotionally harmful?
It's a fair question, and the key is nuance. We can't say Vincent experienced narcissistic abuse. That's a modern clinical term, and there's no evidence of intentional manipulation. But we can say that he lived in relational environments that were often invalidating, inconsistent, or emotionally overwhelming. For someone as sensitive as Vincent, those dynamics can feel destabilizing in ways that resemble what we now call emotional harm.
So, you're saying the issue wasn't manipulation, it was misattunement?
Exactly. Most people in Vincent's life weren't trying to hurt him. They simply didn't understand him. They didn't know how to meet someone with his emotional intensity. But chronic misattunement, being misunderstood, dismissed, or pressured, can feel like emotional injury to a sensitive person, not because anyone is malicious, but because the emotional mismatch is so profound.
Let's talk about his family. Could their expectations have contributed to his suffering?
Absolutely, but not through manipulation. His parents wanted him to be stable, respectable, conventional. Vincent wasn't any of those things. So he grew up feeling wrong, too much, not enough. That's not abuse, but it is a form of emotional pressure that can shape a person's self-worth. For someone like Vincent, that pressure becomes internalized as self-blame.
Interviewer, what about his romantic relationships? Some of them were chaotic.
They were emotionally turbulent, yes. Not because anyone was manipulative, but because Vincent often chose partners who were themselves unstable or unavailable. He entered relationships with enormous emotional intensity. He gave everything. He expected deep connection. And when that wasn't reciprocated, he collapsed inward. Again, not manipulation, but emotional instability that hit him harder than it would hit most people.
And Goguen? Their relationship is often described as toxic.
Toxic is a modern word, but the dynamic was certainly unbalanced. Gwen was dominant, confident, and dismissive. Vincent was sensitive, insecure, and eager for approval. Goggins' criticism cut deeply. His unpredictability destabilized Vincent. His withdrawal of affection or validation triggered Vincent's fear of abandonment. Was Gauguin a narcissistic manipulator? No. But the dynamic between them had elements that today we might recognize as emotionally harmful, especially for someone as vulnerable as Vincent.
So, could these relational patterns have contributed to Vincent's mental collapse?
They didn't cause his illness, but they absolutely amplified his suffering. Vincent's breakdowns were the result of biological vulnerability, chronic mental illness, poverty, isolation, exhaustion, emotional overwhelm. But relational instability, being misunderstood, rejected, or invalidated, made everything worse. He wasn't manipulated into despair. He was unsupported in his despair.
Some people wonder if manipulation or relational harm could have pushed him towards suicide, or even suggest homicide. What do we know?
We know this with confidence. There is no evidence of homicide. Vincent himself told the police and his doctor, "Do not accuse anyone. I wounded myself." His letters show years of despair, exhaustion, and hopelessness. His final months were marked by emotional collapse, not external threat. Relational pain contributed to his suffering, but it did not constitute manipulation, and it did not point to homicide.
Interviewer: So, the tragedy isn't that he was manipulated, it's that he was emotionally unprotected.
Exactly. Vincent wasn't destroyed by narcissistic abuse. He was undone by a lifetime of emotional environments that were too harsh, too inconsistent, or too indifferent for someone with his level of sensitivity. His suffering came from vulnerability without support, sensitivity without understanding, and a world that didn't know how to hold him. And that's the human truth behind his story.
11. What have we learned from Vincent van Gogh's life? Thor, this has been an extraordinary conversation, layered, compassionate, and deeply human. Before we close, I want to ask you one final question. After everything we've explored, his sensitivity, his relationships, his suffering, his art, what have we learned from Vincent van Gogh's life?
I think the greatest lesson is that sensitivity is not a flaw. It's a way of perceiving the world intensely, honestly, vulnerably. Vincent felt everything with a depth that most people never touch. And instead of hardening himself, he translated that sensitivity into color, movement, and emotion. We've learned that a person can be brilliant and fragile at the same time. That someone can create beauty while carrying pain. That emotional misattunement, being misunderstood, dismissed, or unsupported, can wound a sensitive person more deeply than anyone realizes. We've learned that the world often fails the people who feel the most, not out of cruelty, but out of incomprehension. And we've learned something else, something hopeful, that even when a person dies believing they were unloved, unseen, or unsuccessful, their impact can echo far beyond their lifetime. Vincent thought he had failed, but his art became a language of empathy for millions. His sensitivity became his legacy. So, what have we learned? That the world needs its sensitive people, not despite their vulnerability, but because of it.
That's beautifully said, Thor. Thank you for bringing such clarity, compassion, and depth to this conversation. You've helped us see Vincent not as a myth or a symbol, but as a human being, one whose sensitivity shaped both his suffering and his genius.
Thank you. It's been meaningful to explore him this way, not as a tragic figure, but as a reminder of what it means to feel deeply, to create honestly, and to live with a heart that refuses to shut down, even when the world doesn't understand it. If Vincent teaches us anything, it's that sensitivity is a form of courage, and that beauty often comes from those who carry the heaviest emotional weight.
A powerful note to end on. Thank you, Thor, and thank you to everyone listening. May we all learn to see the sensitive souls around us with a little more gentleness, and maybe even recognize the Van Gogh inside ourselves.